The radio crackled with static before Captain Vega, Phantom, Morales heard the words that would define her legacy. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Reaper 37, we are down, repeat, we are down." The transmission cut to nothing but the hiss of dead air. In the cockpit of her FA-18F Super Hornet, 30,000 feet above the Helmand province, Phantom felt her stomach drop. She knew that voice. Staff Sergeant Marcus Tank. Rodriguez had been her wingman during 3 previous deployments, a Marine whose laugh could fill an entire mess hall and whose aim with a rifle was legendary among their squadron. What happened next would become the subject of whispered conversations in ready rooms from 29 Palms to Quantico. Some would call it impossible. Others would say it was the kind of heroism that only existed in Hollywood films. The truth, as it always is with war stories, was far more complex and infinitely more human than any movie could capture. The morning had started like any other in Forward Operating Base Wolverine. The desert sun painted the mountains in shades of rust and gold, while the familiar smell of diesel fuel and dust hung heavy in the air. Phantom had been reviewing flight plans when the call came through on the emergency frequency. A reconnaissance patrol had gone silent 12 clicks northeast of their position, deep in Taliban territory, where the mountains created natural ambush points, and the valleys echoed with the ghosts of previous firefights. "Phantom, you're our eyes up there," Colonel Patricia, Iron Lady Hayes had told her during the briefing. "Get me a picture of what we're dealing with." The colonel's weathered face showed no emotion, but Phantom caught the slight tension around her eyes. They both knew that radio silence in that sector usually meant one thing: catastrophic contact with the enemy. As Phantom's Super Hornet screamed through the thin air at Mach 1.2, her radar painting the terrain below an electronic green, she couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be different. The intelligence reports had been spotty, mentioning increased Taliban activity in the region, but nothing that suggested the level of coordination required to take down an entire Marine patrol. Something felt wrong about the whole situation, like a puzzle piece that refused to fit into place. Below her, the Afghan landscape stretched endlessly, a tapestry of brown and beige that held secrets in every shadow. Somewhere down there, her brothers-in-arms were either fighting for their lives or already beyond help. The Super Hornet's engines hummed with mechanical precision as Phantom began her descent toward the coordinates where Reaper 37 had last been heard from. Through her helmet's heads-up display, thermal imaging revealed the harsh geometry of the mountain landscape, but nothing that looked like human movement or military equipment. The silence from below was deafening, broken only by the steady rhythm of her own breathing inside the oxygen mask and the quiet electronic beeping of her aircraft systems. "Control, this is Phantom," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Beginning reconnaissance run over target area. No visual contact with friendly forces at this time." The response came back immediately, tinged with the barely controlled tension that pervaded all radio communications during search and rescue operations. "Be that Phantom. Be advised, we've lost contact with ground elements for approximately 47 minutes. Last known position grid November Delta 7742. Weapons free on any hostile contacts." The authorization to engage felt heavy in her ears. Weapons free meant the situation had deteriorated beyond hope of a peaceful resolution. It meant Marines were probably dying while she circled overhead like a mechanical vulture, searching for signs of life in an unforgiving landscape. Banking her aircraft into a tight spiral, Phantom dropped to 8,000 feet and activated her targeting pod. The high-definition camera began painting detailed images of the valley floor, revealing the scattered debris that told a story of violence and chaos. Vehicle tracks led from the main road into a narrow canyon, where the walls rose like the ribs of some ancient beast. Following those tracks with her camera, she began to piece together what had happened to Reaper 37. The first Humvee sat at an unnatural angle against a boulder, its front end crumpled like aluminum foil. Smoke still rose from its engine compartment, a thin gray line that dissipated quickly in the desert wind. 30 meters beyond that, a second vehicle lay on its side, surrounded by the geometric patterns of scattered equipment and personal gear. But it was what she saw next that made her blood run cold. 3 figures in desert camouflage were moving slowly across the rocky ground, dragging something behind them. Even from 8,000 feet, Phantom could see the awkward, desperate quality of their movement. These weren't Taliban fighters celebrating a victory. These were wounded Marines trying to reach cover, and they were running out of time. Her targeting system automatically calculated distance and bearing, 600 meters from their current position to the nearest defensible terrain. Control, Phantom has visual on 3 survivors attempting to reach cover. Grid, November Delta 7746. They appear to be dragging casualties and are taking effective fire from multiple positions along the ridgeline. As she spoke, Phantom could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars among the rocks above the struggling Marines. The response from Control crackled with urgency. Copy visual on 3 survivors. Closest ground support is 40 minutes out. Can you provide close air support? Phantom studied her tactical display, calculating angles of attack and collateral damage potential. The Taliban positions were well concealed among the rocks, making precision strikes difficult without risking friendly fire. Worse, her fuel state was already showing amber, meaning she had perhaps 20 minutes of loiter time before she'd be forced to return to base for refueling. 20 minutes to save 3 Marines who were currently crawling across open ground under withering enemy fire. Negative on close air support, she transmitted reluctantly. Too close to friendlies for danger-close operations. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but the mathematics of aerial warfare were unforgiving. One miscalculated bomb could kill the very people she was trying to save. But as she watched through her targeting pod, one of the 3 figures stumbled and fell, a dark stain spreading across the desert sand beneath them. The other 2 Marines immediately moved to help their wounded comrade, exposing themselves further to enemy fire. In that moment, watching her fellow warriors risk everything for each other, Captain Vega, Phantom, Morales made a decision that would echo through Marine Corps legend for decades to come. She was going to land her $70 million fighter jet in a Taliban-controlled valley and go get them herself. The idea was so audacious, so completely against every regulation and tactical doctrine she had ever learned, that for a moment she questioned her own sanity. Fighter pilots didn't perform ground rescues. They provided air support, conducted reconnaissance, and occasionally dropped bombs on bad guys. They absolutely did not land their aircraft in hostile territory to play infantry. The FA-18F Super Hornet wasn't designed for unprepared landing strips, especially not the rocky, uneven terrain of an Afghan valley floor. But as she watched another muzzle flash from the ridgeline and saw one of the Marines below jerk backward from the impact of a bullet, Phantom realized that sometimes regulations and tactical doctrine weren't enough. Sometimes you had to write your own rules, even if it meant risking everything you had trained for and believed in. Control, be advised I am declaring an emergency and attempting a combat landing to extract survivors. Her voice remained calm and professional, but inside her chest, her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She had perhaps 30 seconds to find a suitable landing area before the Taliban fighters on the ridgeline figured out what she was planning and concentrated their fire on her aircraft. Negative, Phantom. Abort that approach immediately. You are not cleared for. She switched off her radio and focused on the most challenging landing of her career. Through her canopy, the desert floor rushed up to meet her at an alarming rate. Her training told her this was suicide. Her heart told her it was the only choice that mattered. The Super Hornet's landing gear extended with mechanical precision as she lined up on what appeared to be the longest, flatest stretch of ground available. Rocks and debris scattered beneath her jet wash as she flared for touchdown, the aircraft's weight settling onto the landing gear with a jarring impact that rattled her teeth. She had done it. Against all odds and common sense, she had successfully landed a multi-million-dollar fighter aircraft in the middle of a firefight. Now came the hard part, getting to those Marines before the Taliban fighters on the ridgeline adjusted their aim and turned her rescue attempt into a catastrophe. Phantom popped her canopy and grabbed her survival rifle from its storage compartment, a lightweight M4 carbine that seemed inadequate for what she was about to attempt. The desert air hit her face like a furnace blast as she climbed down from the cockpit, her flight boots touching Afghan soil for the first time in her career. The sound of gunfire was much louder without the insulation of her aircraft's cockpit. Bullets cracked overhead with the distinctive snap of supersonic projectiles, while the deeper boom of AK-47s echoed off the canyon walls. Phantom oriented herself toward the last known position of the three Marines, roughly 400 meters to her northeast, and began running across the rocky ground with a determination that surprised even herself. She had covered perhaps 50 meters when the bullet shattered her left femur just above the knee. The impact spun her around and sent her sprawling among the rocks, her rifle skittering away into the desert scrub. For a moment, the pain was so intense that her vision tunneled and she thought she might pass out. But through the haze of agony, she could still hear the sound of gunfire and the desperate shouts of wounded Marines calling for help. Rolling onto her stomach, Phantom began to crawl toward the sound of those voices. Each movement sent waves of fire up her shattered leg, but she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Behind her, she could hear the distinctive whine of her Super Hornet's engines beginning to spool down as the aircraft settled into what would probably be its final resting place. Ahead of her, somewhere among the rocks and desert scrub, three Marines were fighting for their lives. The crawl across that deadly ground would take her 47 minutes and cost her more blood than any human being should be able to lose and still remain conscious. But Captain Vega, Phantom, Morales had not earned her call sign by giving up when things got difficult. She had earned it by being the pilot who could appear out of nowhere when her fellow warriors needed her most, and then vanish back into the sky as if she had never been there at all. Today, she wouldn't be vanishing back into the sky. Today, she would prove that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought at 30,000 feet, but on the ground, one painful meter at a time, with nothing but willpower and the unbreakable bonds of military brotherhood to sustain you. The first Marine she reached was Corporal Diego Wheels Vasquez, a 22-year-old machine gunner from East Los Angeles whose left shoulder had been shattered by Taliban rifle fire. He was conscious but pale from blood loss, his eyes wide with shock and pain as Phantom dragged herself up beside him. "Holy shit, ma'am," Wheels whispered, staring at her flight suit and the dark stain spreading down her left leg. "You actually landed that jet in this hellhole." His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude that made Phantom's chest tight with emotion she couldn't afford to feel right now. "Language Marine," she replied with a weak smile, beginning to apply pressure to his wounded shoulder with a field dressing from her survival kit. "Where are the others?" Even as she spoke, bullets continued to crack overhead, reminding them both that they were still very much in the middle of a firefight. Wheels nodded toward a pile of rocks about 30 meters away. "Rodriguez caught one in the chest, and Kowalski's got a head wound. They're both breathing, but—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Phantom understood. Time was running out for all of them, and the Taliban fighters on the ridgeline were beginning to adjust their fire patterns, walking their shots closer to the Marines' position with each passing minute. Using her good leg and both arms, Phantom began the agonizing process of dragging Wheels toward the rock pile where the other two Marines were sheltering. Every few meters, they had to stop and press themselves flat against the ground as bullets spanged off the rocks around them, sending fragments of stone spinning through the air like deadly confetti. "Why did you do it?" Wheels asked during one of their rest stops, his face tight with pain but his eyes focused on hers with laser intensity. "You could have called for backup, waited for the cavalry. Why risk your bird and your life for three grunts you barely know?" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Phantom was quiet for a long moment, listening to the distant sound of gunfire and feeling the warmth of her own blood soaking through her flight suit. How do you explain to someone that there are moments in life when all the training and regulations and careful calculations become irrelevant? How do you tell a wounded Marine that sometimes you just know, with absolute certainty, that this is your moment to stand up and be counted, regardless of the consequences? Because that's what we do, she finally said, the simplicity of the words carrying more weight than any elaborate explanation could have managed. We don't leave our people behind. Ever. She began crawling again, dragging wheels behind her, each movement a small victory against the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. When they finally reached the rock pile, Phantom found Staff Sergeant Rodriguez propped against a boulder, his desert camouflage uniform dark with blood from a chest wound that looked far too serious for field treatment. His breathing was shallow and labored, but his eyes were alert and tracking as she crawled up beside him. "Phantom," Rodriguez whispered, recognition dawning in his pain-glazed eyes. "Thought I heard your bird come in. Please tell me you've got a plan to get us out of this mess." Despite his wounds, he managed a weak smile that reminded Phantom why she had always liked flying with Tank Rodriguez. The man could find humor in the middle of Armageddon. "Working on it," she replied, beginning to assess his injuries while bullets continued to crack overhead. The chest wound was bad, probably a through-and-through that had missed his heart by inches. He needed a hospital, not a field dressing, but she did what she could with the limited medical supplies in her survival kit. Private First Class Tommy Kowalski was unconscious but breathing, a head wound that had painted half his face with blood, making him look far worse than he actually was. At 19, he was the youngest member of their patrol, a kid from Nebraska who had joined the Marines to pay for college and found himself in the middle of a war that would define the rest of his life, assuming he survived the next few hours. As Phantom worked on their wounds, she could hear the sound of helicopters in the distance, growing louder with each passing minute. The cavalry was finally coming, but they would need a landing zone secure enough to extract casualties under fire. That meant someone would have to suppress the Taliban positions on the ridgeline long enough for the helicopters to get in and out safely. "How many magazines you got left?" she asked Rodriguez, checking the action on her survival rifle. He patted his ammunition pouches and grimaced. "Maybe 3 full mags," he replied. "Kowalski's got 2, and Wheels is down to his last 30 rounds. What are you thinking, ma'am?" The formal address sounded strange in the middle of a firefight, but military courtesy died hard, even when you were bleeding to death in an Afghan valley. Phantom studied the ridgeline through her rifle scope, counting muzzle flashes and trying to estimate the number of Taliban fighters they were facing. At least 8, possibly more, all in well-concealed positions that would be difficult to suppress with their limited ammunition. But the helicopters were getting closer, and someone needed to keep those fighters' heads down long enough for a successful extraction. "I'm going to move to that outcropping over there," she said, pointing to a rock formation about 50 meters away that would give her a better angle on the Taliban positions. "When the choppers come in, I'll lay down covering fire. You 3 stay put and try not to bleed to death while I'm gone." Rodriguez grabbed her arm as she started to crawl away. "Ma'am, with respect, you're shot to hell and barely conscious. This is a job for Marines, not Air Force." His voice carried genuine concern mixed with professional pride that would have been amusing under different circumstances. "I'm Navy, you jarhead," Phantom replied with a grin that didn't quite hide the pain in her eyes. "And right now, I'm the only one of us who can make that shot." She was right, and they both knew it. Her marksmanship scores had always been exceptional, even by Marine standards, and the angle from the outcropping would give her clear lines of sight to at least half the Taliban positions. The crawl to the outcropping took 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours. By the time Phantom reached the firing position, the helicopters were close enough that she could identify them as a pair of US-60 Black Hawks, probably carrying a full medical team and enough Marines to secure the landing zone. But first, she had to clear the way. Setting up her rifle in a stable shooting position, Phantom began the methodical process of engaging targets on the ridgeline. The first Taliban fighter never knew what hit him, her bullet taking him center mass as he exposed himself to get a better shot at the approaching helicopters. The second fighter was more cautious, but patience and precision paid off when he made the mistake of trying to relocate to a better position. One by one, she began to silence the guns on the ridgeline, each shot carefully aimed and precisely placed despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. The return fire was intense, bullets striking the rocks around her position with metallic ringing sounds that reminded her of a deadly wind chime. But she kept shooting, methodically working her way through the Taliban positions with the cold precision that had made her one of the Navy's finest pilots. When the first Black Hawk touched down in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, Phantom was still firing, her rifle barrel hot enough to cause heat mirages in the desert air. The second helicopter circled overhead, its door gunners adding their own firepower to the mix as Marines poured out of the first aircraft and began to establish a defensive perimeter around the landing zone. The extraction took less than 5 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime as medics worked to stabilize the wounded Marines, while combat engineers prepared her disabled Super Hornet for destruction. Military protocol demanded that the aircraft's sensitive electronics and weapon systems be rendered useless to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, a process that would erase millions of dollars of taxpayer investment in a few pounds of carefully placed explosives. As they loaded her onto a stretcher beside Rodriguez, Wheels, and Kowalski, Phantom watched through the helicopter's window as her fighter jet disappeared in a brilliant flash of orange flame and black smoke. It was a sight that should have filled her with regret, but all she felt was a profound sense of satisfaction. 3 Marines were going home to their families because she had been willing to sacrifice her aircraft and risk her life to save them. The flight back to Forward Operating Base Wolverine passed in a haze of morphine and exhaustion, but Phantom remained conscious long enough to see the faces of her fellow Marines as they realized what she had accomplished. The story would spread through the base like wildfire, growing in the telling until it became the stuff of legend. But for now, it was enough to know that Rodriguez, Wheels, and Kowalski would live to fight another day. Colonel Patricia, Iron Lady, Hayes was waiting at the landing pad when the helicopters touched down, her weathered face showing none of the emotion that Phantom knew must be churning beneath the surface. As they wheeled her stretcher toward the medical tent, the colonel fell into step beside her, her voice barely audible above the sound of rotor wash and diesel generators. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest," Hayes said, her tone carefully neutral. "Probably both. The brass is going to want to court-martial you for destroying a $70 million aircraft without authorization." She paused, studying Phantom's face with eyes that had seen too much war and too many good Marines come home in body bags. "Let them try," Phantom replied, her voice weak but defiant. "Those 3 Marines are worth more than any piece of equipment, and if the brass can't see that, then they've forgotten what we're fighting for." It was a statement that would be repeated in ready rooms and barracks throughout the Corps, becoming part of the mythology that surrounded Captain Vega, Phantom Morales. In the medical tent, Navy surgeons worked for 8 hours to save her leg, installing titanium pins and plates that would hold her shattered femur together long enough for the bone to heal. The doctors said she would walk again, though she would probably always have a limp, and her flying days were almost certainly over. But as she drifted off under anesthesia, Phantom found herself thinking not about what she had lost, but about what she had gained. She had proven to herself and everyone else that being a pilot didn't make you less of a warrior. It just gave you a different perspective on the battlefield. She had learned that sometimes the most important missions weren't the ones you planned for, but the ones that chose you in moments of crisis when ordinary people were called upon to do extraordinary things. Most importantly, She had discovered that the bonds between warriors transcended branch rivalry and professional jealousy. Whether you wore wings or carried a rifle, whether you fought from the sky or crawled through the dirt, you were all part of something larger than yourself, something that demanded the very best of your courage and commitment. The story of her rescue mission would be told and retold for years to come, inspiring new generations of Marines and pilots to push beyond their perceived limitations when lives hung in the balance. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez would name his first daughter Vega in her honor. Corporal Vasquez would become a military contractor specializing in close air support coordination, crediting Phantom's example with teaching him that the sky and ground were just different parts of the same battlefield. But perhaps the most lasting impact of that day would be felt in the way Marine aviators approached their mission from that point forward. The artificial barriers between air and ground personnel began to erode as pilots realized that their job wasn't just to provide support from above, but to be an integral part of the team fighting on the ground. The phrase, "one team, one fight," took on new meaning in Marine aviation circles. Years later, when military historians tried to analyze what made Captain Vega, Phantom, Morales's rescue mission so significant, they would focus on the tactical innovations and the unprecedented nature of landing a fighter jet in a combat zone to extract wounded personnel. But those who were there that day understood that the real significance lay not in what she did, but in why she did it. She had made the choice that every warrior hopes they would make when faced with an impossible situation. She had put the lives of her fellow service members above her own safety, her career, and even the expensive equipment entrusted to her care. In doing so, she had embodied the very best traditions of military service and reminded everyone that the most important battles are often fought not for territory or political objectives, but for the person fighting beside you. The medal ceremony took place 6 months later at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, with Phantom walking across the stage on her rebuilt leg to receive the Navy Cross from the Commandant of the Marine Corps himself. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against an armed enemy, while serving as a pilot with Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 314. Captain Morales displayed exceptional courage and selfless dedication to duty when she landed her aircraft under fire in enemy territory to rescue wounded Marines." But the words on the citation could never capture the full impact of what happened in that Afghan valley, or the way it changed everyone who witnessed it. Sometimes the most important stories can't be reduced to official language and formal recognition. Sometimes they can only be understood by those who have felt the weight of a wounded comrade's life in their hands and made the conscious decision to carry that burden no matter the cost to themselves. As Phantom stood at attention during the medal ceremony, her rebuilt leg aching but supporting her weight, she thought about the 3 Marines sitting in the audience whose lives had been forever changed by 30 minutes of violence in a nameless valley halfway around the world. She thought about the Super Hornet that had carried her faithfully through 3 deployments before she asked it to attempt one final, impossible mission. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she had switched off her radio and committed herself to a course of action that defied every regulation and protocol she had ever learned. In that moment, she had discovered something that no amount of training or simulation could teach: that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when action is the only choice that preserves what matters most. The story of Captain Vega, Phantom, Morales would be told in military academies and training schools for decades to come, inspiring new generations of pilots and ground personnel to think beyond the traditional boundaries of their roles. But for those who lived through that day in the Afghan mountains, it would always be more than just a story. It would be a reminder that in the darkest moments of combat, when everything seems hopeless and the enemy has you surrounded, there are still people willing to risk everything to bring you home safely. And sometimes, when the situation is desperate enough and the stakes high enough, Those people will crawl 600 meters through enemy fire with a shattered leg to prove that no one gets left behind, no matter what the cost. That's not just heroism. That's what it means to be a Marine, whether you carry a rifle or fly a fighter jet, whether you fight from the ground or rain death from the sky. 3 years after the medal ceremony, Captain Vega, Phantom, Morales stood before a classroom of flight school candidates at Naval Air Station Pensacola, her rebuilt leg barely noticeable except for the slight favor she gave it when walking. The eager faces staring back at her reminded her of herself 15 years ago, when she had first dreamed of earning her wings and serving her country from the cockpit of a fighter jet. But these young aviators would learn something she had never been taught in flight school. That sometimes the most important mission happens when your engines are silent and your feet are on the ground. "Who can tell me the primary mission of naval aviation?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had tested the boundaries of what was possible and lived to tell about it. A dozen hands shot up immediately, each candidate eager to demonstrate their knowledge of doctrine and procedures. She selected a young woman in the front row whose intensity reminded her uncomfortably of herself at that age. "Ma'am, the primary mission of naval aviation is to project power from the sea and provide close air support to ground forces," the candidate recited with textbook precision. It was the correct answer, the one that would earn full marks on any written examination. But Phantom had learned that sometimes the textbook answers weren't enough to save lives when everything went wrong. "That's what the manual says," Phantom replied, beginning to pace in front of the classroom with the measured steps of someone who had learned to walk again through sheer determination. "But let me tell you what naval aviation is really about. It's about the moment when every regulation you've ever memorized becomes irrelevant because someone's life depends on you making the right choice, not the safe choice." She pressed a button on the remote control, and the classroom's projection screen filled with an image of her FA-18F Super Hornet sitting in that Afghan valley, its landing gear extended, and its canopy open like a metallic flower blooming in the desert. The photograph had been taken by one of the Marines from the rescue helicopters, and it had become an iconic image representing the lengths to which aviators would go for their fellow service members. "This is my aircraft, Call Sign Phantom 01, photographed in Helmand Province on a day when I made a decision that violated every flight safety regulation in existence," she continued, her voice steady, but carrying an undertone of emotion that made every candidate in the room lean forward in their seats. "I'm going to tell you about that day, not because I want you to repeat what I did, but because I want you to understand what it means to be part of something larger than yourself." The story unfolded in the same clinical, matter-of-fact tone that military instructors used to describe combat operations, but the candidates could sense the weight behind every word. They heard about the radio call that had changed everything, the impossible choice between following orders and saving lives, the split-second decision to land a fighter jet in enemy territory. But most importantly, they heard about the moment when Captain Phantom Morales had stopped being a pilot and started being a Marine. "The bullet that shattered my femur taught me something that no flight simulator could ever replicate," she said, unconsciously shifting her weight to her good leg as the memory of that pain flickered across her face. "It taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. Courage is about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway because someone is counting on you to bring them home." One of the male candidates raised his hand tentatively. "Ma'am, what happened to your aircraft after the mission?" It was a practical question from someone who understood the value of military equipment and the consequences of losing expensive hardware in combat operations. Phantom smiled, recognizing the mindset of a young aviator who still thought in terms of machines rather than people. "The combat engineers destroyed it with controlled demolitions to prevent the technology from falling into enemy hands," she replied. $70 million turned into scrap metal and smoke, but 3 Marines went home to their families that day, and I've never regretted that trade for a single moment." The classroom fell silent as the candidates absorbed the implications of what they had just heard. Most of them had grown up playing video games where aircraft were expendable resources that could be respawned with the press of a button. The idea of deliberately sacrificing such valuable equipment to save human lives was both inspiring and terrifying to young minds that had been trained to think in terms of cost-benefit analysis and operational efficiency. The Marine Corps taught me that people are more valuable than equipment, Phantom continued, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. But it took crawling 600 meters through enemy fire to truly understand what that meant. Every one of you will face moments in your career when you have to choose between the safe option and the right option. I can't tell you which choice to make, but I can tell you that you'll have to live with the consequences either way. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of herself standing with Rodriguez, Vasquez, and Kowalski at a Marine Corps birthday ball 2 years after their rescue. All four of them were in dress blues, their ribbons and medals creating colorful displays across their chests, but it was their smiles that told the real story. These were people who had looked death in the face together and emerged with bonds stronger than steel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez retired after 20 years and now teaches high school mathematics in San Antonio, she said, pointing to Tank's image on the screen. He tells his students that the most important equation isn't found in any textbook. One person willing to sacrifice for others equals infinite possibilities for everyone else. His daughter Vega just started her sophomore year at Texas A&M, studying aerospace engineering. The candidates chuckled at the connection, but Phantom could see some of them taking notes, already recognizing that this lesson extended far beyond aviation tactics and flight procedures. They were learning about leadership, about making decisions that would define not just their careers but their character as human beings. Corporal Vasquez completed his enlistment and now works as a contractor supporting close air support operations and training exercises. She continued, her voice warming as she spoke about wheels. He credits that day in Afghanistan with teaching him that the artificial boundaries between air and ground personnel are meaningless when lives are on the line. He saved dozens of training accidents by recognizing when pilots and ground controllers aren't communicating effectively. She paused on Private Kowalski's image, her expression growing more serious. Tommy Kowalski was medically retired due to traumatic brain injury from his head wound, but he completed his college degree using his GI Bill benefits and now works for the Veterans Administration, helping other wounded warriors navigate the system. He says that watching me crawl across that valley taught him that giving up is never an option as long as someone needs your help. The final slide showed a recent photograph of all four of them at the dedication of a memorial to fallen Marines at Camp Pendleton. They were older now, carrying the weight of years and experience, but their bond remained evident in the way they stood together, comfortable in each other's presence in the way that only people who had shared life-and-death experiences could be. The point of telling you this story isn't to encourage reckless heroics or violation of safety procedures, Phantom said, returning to her position at the front of the classroom. The point is to help you understand that being a naval aviator means accepting responsibility for the lives of everyone who depends on you, whether they're sitting in your back seat or crawling through enemy fire 600 meters away. She looked around the classroom, making eye contact with each candidate in turn. Some of you will fly combat missions. Some will provide humanitarian assistance during natural disasters. Some will test new aircraft and push the boundaries of what's possible in aviation. But all of you will face moments when someone's life depends on your ability to make the right choice under pressure. When that moment comes, remember that your training and your equipment are tools, but your character is what will determine whether you succeed or fail. The questions that followed revealed the depth of impact her story had made on the young aviators. They asked about decision-making under pressure, about the psychological aftermath of combat, about maintaining morale when missions went wrong. But the question that stuck with Phantom came from a quiet female candidate in the back row who had barely spoken during previous classes. "Ma'am," she said hesitantly, "how do you deal with the knowledge that you might have to make that choice someday? How do you prepare for something that can't be trained for?" It was the question of someone who understood that courage couldn't be learned from textbooks or simulators, but had to be discovered within yourself when everything else failed. Phantom considered her answer carefully, remembering her own fears and doubts as a young aviator. "You don't prepare for it," she said finally. "You just make sure that when the moment comes, your instincts are grounded in the right values. If you truly believe that your fellow service members are worth any sacrifice, then your actions will flow naturally from that belief. The hard part isn't making the choice in the moment. The hard part is living with integrity every day so that, when the moment comes, you're the kind of person who makes the right choice automatically." After the class ended and the candidates filed out, discussing the lesson in excited whispers, Phantom remained at the podium, staring at the image of her destroyed Super Hornet still displayed on the screen. Teaching these young aviators about her experience had become both a privilege and a burden, forcing her to relive that day in Afghanistan while also ensuring that its lessons would be passed on to future generations. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Rodriguez. "Saw your lecture on the flight school live stream. Vega says to tell her namesake that she's proud to share your name. Hope you're still scaring the hell out of those baby pilots with war stories." The message was followed by a photo of his daughter in her Texas A&M Aerospace Engineering t-shirt, holding a model of an FA-18 Super Hornet. Phantom smiled, feeling the familiar mixture of pride and melancholy that accompanied thoughts of her old aircraft and the mission that had ended her flying career but defined her legacy. She had traded her wings for the opportunity to shape the next generation of aviators, and some days that felt like a fair exchange. Other days, she missed the solitude of high-altitude flight and the clean simplicity of mechanical challenges that had clear solutions. But as she watched the last of her students disappear down the hallway, their voices animated with discussions of tactics and ethics, she knew that her most important mission was just beginning. These young aviators would face challenges that she could barely imagine, operating in an increasingly complex world where the lines between combat and humanitarian operations were constantly shifting. They would need more than technical skills and tactical knowledge to succeed. They would need the moral courage to make difficult choices when lives hung in the balance. Walking back to her office, Phantom passed the wall of honor displaying photographs of naval aviation alumni who had distinguished themselves in service to their country. Her own photograph hung there now, showing her in flight gear beside her Super Hornet during happier times, before she had learned what it meant to sacrifice everything for 3 Marines she barely knew. The caption beneath her image read, "Captain Vega, Phantom Morales, Navy Cross recipient for extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Afghanistan 2021. But the words that mattered most to her weren't on any official citation or memorial plaque. They were in the thank you letters she received from the families of Marines whose lives had been touched by her story, from young aviators who credited her example with giving them the courage to push beyond their perceived limitations, from veterans who had found inspiration in her willingness to sacrifice her career for her principles. The real measure of her legacy wouldn't be found in the medals or commendations gathering dust in her office, but in the decisions that her former students would make when they faced their own impossible moments. If even one of them chose to risk everything to save a fellow service member because they remembered the story of Phantom and her 600-meter crawl through enemy fire, then her sacrifice would have meaning that extended far beyond that single day in Afghanistan. As she settled at her desk to prepare for the next day's lessons, Phantom opened her laptop and began typing a new presentation about the ethics of command decisions under fire. The young aviators needed to understand that wearing wings came with responsibilities that extended far beyond the cockpit, that leadership meant accepting the weight of other people's lives, and carrying that burden with grace and determination. Outside her window, she could hear the sound of training aircraft practicing touch-and-go landings, their engines rising and falling in the familiar rhythm of naval aviation. Somewhere among those pilots were the students she had taught, learning to push the boundaries of their abilities while maintaining the discipline and judgment that would keep them alive when they faced real combat operations. The sound reminded her of her own training days, when the world had seemed full of infinite possibilities, and every flight had been an adventure in discovery. She had lost that innocence in the mountains of Afghanistan, but she had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that courage wasn't about being unafraid, but about acting in spite of fear when action was the only choice that preserved what mattered most. Her phone rang, interrupting her work on the presentation. The caller ID showed Colonel Hayes, now retired and working as a consultant on military aviation policy. "Phantom," the familiar voice said without preamble, "I just wanted to let you know that the Commandant is considering your proposal for the new combat rescue doctrine. Word is that your Afghan mission has become the case study for close air support integration with ground operations." It was news that should have filled her with pride, but instead Phantom felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with knowing that her actions had consequences extending far beyond her own life. "That's good to hear, Colonel," she replied. "But I hope they remember that what I did that day wasn't doctrine. It was desperation. We can't train people to land fighter jets in combat zones, but we can train them to think creatively when conventional solutions aren't available." "That's exactly why your story matters," Hayes responded. "It shows that sometimes the most important victories come when we're willing to abandon the playbook and improvise based on our values rather than our training. The young aviators coming up through the system need to understand that flexibility and moral courage are just as important as technical proficiency." After the call ended, Phantom returned to her presentation, but her mind kept wandering to the faces of her current students and the challenges they would face in their careers. The world was changing rapidly, with new technologies and evolving threats requiring constant adaptation and innovation. The aviators she was training would need to be more than just skilled pilots. They would need to be leaders capable of making ethical decisions under extreme pressure. The story of her rescue mission had become a teaching tool, but she never wanted it to become a legend that obscured the human cost of her choices. 3 Marines had lived because she was willing to sacrifice her aircraft and risk her life, but that same decision had ended her flying career and left her with permanent injuries that would affect her for the rest of her life. Heroism always came with a price, and she wanted her students to understand both the rewards and the consequences of extraordinary action. As the sun set over Naval Air Station Pensacola, Phantom finished her presentation and prepared to head home to her small apartment near the base. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to share the lessons learned in that Afghan valley. She had traded her wings for the chance to shape the future of naval aviation, and despite the sacrifices involved, she knew it was exactly where she belonged. 5 years later, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Echo Chen stood in the same classroom where Phantom had once taught, facing her own group of flight school candidates. But unlike her predecessor, Echo was preparing to deploy to the South China Sea, where tensions with Chinese naval forces had escalated to the point where combat seemed inevitable. The doctrine that Phantom had helped develop was about to face its first real test since Afghanistan. "Ma'am," one of the candidates asked after Echo's briefing on current threat assessments, "is it true that Captain Morales actually landed her Super Hornet in a combat zone to rescue Marines?" The question carried the skeptical tone of someone who had grown up on social media and assumed that most military legends were exaggerated for effect. Echo smiled, remembering her own doubts when she had first heard Phantom's story as a young lieutenant. "Not only is it true," she replied, "but Captain Morales was my instructor when I went through advanced tactical training. She taught me that the most important weapon system in any aircraft isn't the radar or the missiles. It's the pilot's willingness to adapt when the mission doesn't go according to plan. The candidate's expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity. What was she like as an instructor? I mean, after everything that happened to her. It was a question that Echo had been asked countless times during her own career, usually by young aviators trying to understand how someone could transition from legendary hero to patient teacher without losing their edge. Demanding, Echo replied without hesitation. She expected perfection in everything we did, but not because she was trying to punish us. She knew that someday our lives and the lives of others would depend on our ability to perform flawlessly under pressure. Every lesson she taught was backed up by real experience, not just theory from textbooks and simulations. Echo clicked to the next slide in her presentation, which showed a satellite image of contested waters in the South China Sea. The principles Captain Morales taught us are more relevant now than ever. We're facing an adversary with advanced technology and sophisticated tactics, operating in an environment where the rules of engagement change daily. The aviators who succeed out there will be the ones who can think creatively while maintaining discipline under fire. After the briefing, Echo walked across the base to a small memorial garden that had been dedicated to Phantom, following her retirement from active duty 2 years earlier. The centerpiece was a bronze statue of a pilot's helmet resting on a rock cairn, with a plaque that read, "In memory of all aviators who have pushed beyond the possible to serve others." It was a fitting tribute to someone who had redefined what naval aviation could accomplish when conventional solutions weren't enough. Echo found herself making this pilgrimage whenever she faced difficult decisions, drawn by the memory of her former instructor's unwavering commitment to doing what was right regardless of the personal cost. Tomorrow, she would deploy to one of the most dangerous regions in the world, leading a squadron of pilots who would look to her for guidance when everything went wrong. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing, but she drew strength from Phantom's example. Her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Pentagon. Operation Neptune's Trident authorized. Execute Phase 1 upon arrival in theater. Row package follows. Echo read the message twice, then deleted it according to security protocols. Neptune's Trident was the contingency plan for responding to Chinese aggression in international waters, a complex operation that would require precise coordination between air and naval forces. The kind of mission where split-second decisions could determine the outcome of a larger conflict. As she walked back to her quarters to finish packing, Echo thought about the conversation she'd had with Phantom during their last meeting before her retirement. The hardest part of command isn't making the big decisions, Phantom had told her while they sat in the same classroom where she had once taught flight school candidates. It's living with the knowledge that every choice you make affects the people who trust you to bring them home safely. The wisdom of those words had become clear during Echo's first combat deployment, when she had been forced to abort a rescue mission because the risk to her own aircraft was too great. The pilot she left behind had been captured and spent 6 months as a prisoner before diplomatic negotiations secured his release. The guilt from that decision still kept her awake some nights, wondering if she had been too cautious, too concerned with following procedures instead of taking the kind of risk that Phantom had taken in Afghanistan. But Phantom had helped her understand that second-guessing battlefield decisions was a luxury that commanders couldn't afford. "You make the best choice you can with the information available," she had said during one of their mentoring sessions. "Then you learn from the outcome and try to make better choices next time. The moment you start paralyzed by doubt is the moment you stop being effective as a leader." Now, facing her most challenging deployment yet, Echo carried those lessons with her, along with the tactical knowledge that had made her one of the Navy's most promising young commanders. The South China Sea operation would test everything she had learned about leadership, tactics, and the kind of moral courage that couldn't be taught in simulators or classrooms. 3 days later, Echo found herself in the cockpit of her FA-18F Super Hornet, flying over contested waters where Chinese naval vessels had established what they claimed was a training exercise, but which intelligence reports suggested was preparation for occupation of disputed islands. The tension was palpable in every radio transmission, with both sides operating under rules of engagement that prohibited firing first, but required immediate response to any hostile act. Neptune lead, this is Overwatch. The voice of the airborne early warning aircraft crackled through her headset. We have multiple surface contacts approaching the exclusion zone. Recommend you investigate and report. The formal language couldn't hide the underlying message. Chinese forces were testing American resolve, probing for weaknesses in their response. Echo acknowledged the transmission and signaled her wingman to follow as she descended toward the surface to get a visual identification of the approaching vessels. Through her targeting pod, she could see a formation of Chinese destroyers and frigates, their sophisticated radar systems painting her aircraft with electronic energy as they tracked her approach. The cat-and-mouse game of modern naval warfare was beginning, with both sides trying to gain tactical advantage without crossing the line into open conflict. Neptune lead has visual on 6 surface combatants, Chinese Navy Type 52D destroyers and Type 54A frigates, she transmitted back to Overwatch. They appear to be conducting aggressive maneuvering within the disputed zone. As she spoke, Echo could see weapon systems on the Chinese ships tracking her aircraft, a clear indication that they were prepared for combat even if they weren't actively seeking it. The response from Overwatch carried new urgency. Neptune lead, be advised we're detecting launch preparations from multiple surface contacts. Recommend you maintain safe distance and continue monitoring. Echo felt her pulse quicken as she realized that the situation was escalating beyond the routine harassment that had characterized most encounters in the region. The Chinese commanders were either bluffing with an elaborate show of force, or they were preparing to take action that would trigger the first major naval engagement in decades. Banking away from the Chinese formation, Echo climbed to a safer altitude while maintaining surveillance of their activities. Her training with Phantom had taught her to think several steps ahead in situations like this, considering not just the immediate tactical picture, but the broader implications of every action she took. One mistake could trigger a conflict that would draw in allies on both sides and potentially escalate to global war. Neptune 2 maintain defensive posture but be prepared for evasive maneuvers, she transmitted to her wingman, Lieutenant Jake Hammer Morrison, a young pilot who reminded her of herself when she had first learned to fly with Phantom Squadron. These guys are looking for an excuse to start shooting, and I don't want to give them one. Morrison's response revealed both professionalism and underlying tension. Copy that lead. I've got multiple radar locks but no missile launches yet. How long do we maintain this dance? It was a fair question from a pilot who understood that the longer they remained in the area, the greater the chance that someone would make a mistake that could have catastrophic consequences. Before Echo could respond, her threat warning system erupted in alarms as multiple surface-to-air missiles lifted off from the Chinese ships below. Neptune flight, we have SAM launches. Repeat, SAM launches. All aircraft execute evasive maneuvers. The formal protocols of peacetime operations dissolved instantly as combat became reality, with split-second decisions now determining who would live and who would die. Echo threw her Super Hornet into a violent defensive maneuver, dispensing chaff and flares while diving toward the deck to complicate the missile's tracking solutions. Through her peripheral vision, she could see Morrison's aircraft following similar evasive patterns, both pilots drawing on years of training to survive the next few critical seconds. The missiles streaked past them, their proximity fuses failing to detonate as the American fighters successfully evaded the attack. Neptune lead to Overwatch. We are taking fire from Chinese surface combatants, Echo transmitted while continuing evasive maneuvers. Request immediate backup and authorization to return fire. The formal request for permission to engage felt absurd when people were actively trying to kill her, but rules of engagement existed for good reasons, and she wasn't about to start a war without proper authorization. The response came back immediately. Neptune lead, you are cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared hot. Defend yourself and neutralize the threat. It was the authorization she had trained for but hoped never to receive, the moment when peacetime operations transformed into combat and everything she had learned from Phantom about making hard choices under pressure became vital to survival. Echo selected air-to-surface missiles from her weapons menu and began lining up attack runs on the Chinese ships that had fired on her aircraft. The targeting process required steady hands and clear thinking despite the adrenaline flooding her system, drawing on muscle memory developed through countless hours of training with simulated threats. But this time, real people would die if she made the right choice, and real people would continue trying to kill her if she made the wrong one. Neptune 2, I'm engaging the lead destroyer with Harpoon missiles, she transmitted to Morrison. Cover my approach and be ready to follow up with your own attack if my missiles don't achieve sufficient damage. The clinical language of combat communications helped maintain focus during moments when emotional reactions could prove fatal, but Echo couldn't ignore the weight of what she was about to do. The Harpoon missile dropped away from her aircraft and immediately activated its own guidance system, skimming just above the wave tops as it raced toward the Chinese destroyer at nearly the speed of sound. Echo watched through her targeting pod as the missile's radar seeker locked onto its target and began its final approach, knowing that in a few seconds she would either neutralize a major threat or escalate the engagement to a level that might be impossible to control. The explosion, when it came, was visible even from her altitude as a brilliant flash, followed by a column of black smoke rising from the destroyer's superstructure. Her missile had found its target, but the Chinese ship remained afloat and appeared to be maintaining combat capability despite the damage. The engagement was far from over, and Echo realized that she was now committed to a fight that would test every lesson Phantom had ever taught her about courage, leadership, and the cost of making hard choices under fire. Good hit, lead. Morrison's voice crackled with excitement and adrenaline. Looks like you got their forward missile battery, but they're still maneuvering and the other ships are moving to support. His assessment matched what Echo could see through her own sensors, a complex tactical situation where success would require coordinated attacks and precise timing to prevent the Chinese formation from overwhelming their two-aircraft element. As Echo maneuvered for her second attack run, she found herself thinking about the 3 Marines that Phantom had crawled 600 meters to save in Afghanistan. The situations were completely different, but the underlying principle remained the same. Sometimes you had to risk everything to protect the people counting on you to succeed. Today, those people included not just her wingman, but potentially every American service member operating in the South China Sea, and the broader question of whether aggression would be rewarded with territorial gains. The lessons learned in that Afghan valley were about to be tested in an entirely new environment, where the stakes were higher, and the consequences of failure could reshape the balance of power in one of the world's most important maritime regions. Echo had learned from one of the best instructors in naval aviation, and now it was time to prove that those lessons could be adapted to meet challenges that Phantom could never have imagined when she made her own impossible choice years earlier. The second wave of Chinese missiles was already in the air, and Echo had perhaps 30 seconds to complete her attack before she would be forced into another series of desperate evasive maneuvers. The clock was ticking, lives hung in the balance, and everything she had learned about courage and leadership was about to be put to the ultimate test in the unforgiving environment of modern naval combat. Her targeting system locked onto the second Chinese destroyer, and Echo felt the familiar calm that came with complete focus on the task at hand. Phantom had taught her that fear was natural, but panic was a choice that could be overcome through training and determination. Today, she would honor that lesson by proving that the values learned in that Afghan rescue could be applied to any situation where ordinary people were asked to do extraordinary things. The missile left her aircraft with a slight jolt, beginning its deadly journey toward a target whose crew probably included young sailors not much different from the American pilots they were fighting. War was always a tragedy, even when it was necessary. But Echo had learned from Phantom that sometimes tragic choices were the only ones that preserved something more important than individual lives. Today, that something was the principle that aggression shouldn't be rewarded, and that international law meant something even in the face of superior numbers. As her second Harpoon missile streaked toward its target, Echo was already planning her next move in a battle that would either end quickly with Chinese withdrawal or escalate into the kind of major naval engagement that hadn't been seen since World War II. Either way, she was ready to follow Phantom's example by doing whatever was necessary to protect the people counting on her leadership, no matter what the personal cost might be. The explosion from her second missile strike lit up the horizon, and Echo allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction as she watched another Chinese destroyer begin listing to port, its combat capabilities severely degraded by her precise attack. But the celebration was premature, as her threat warning system began screaming again, with indications of multiple new missile launches from the remaining Chinese ships. The battle was far from over, and Echo realized that she was about to face the kind of sustained combat that would test every aspect of her training and character. "Neptune 2, we've got more SAMs in the air," she transmitted to Morrison while beginning another series of evasive maneuvers. "Stay close and follow my lead. We're not done here yet." The calm authority in her voice surprised even her, evidence that Phantom's lessons about leadership under pressure had taken root more deeply than she had realized. As the missiles closed in and Echo prepared for what might be the fight of her life, she found herself drawing strength from the memory of a woman who had been willing to crawl 600 meters through enemy fire with a shattered leg to save 3 Marines she barely knew. If Phantom could find the courage to make that sacrifice, then Echo could find the courage to face whatever challenges awaited her in the contested waters of the South China Sea. The battle was just beginning, but Echo was ready for whatever came next, armed with lessons learned from one of naval aviation's greatest heroes and the unshakable conviction that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Phantom's legacy lived on in the decisions of every pilot she had trained, and today that legacy would be tested in the crucible of modern combat where courage and skill determined who lived and who died. In the end, Echo realized, it all came down to the same simple truth that Phantom had discovered in that Afghan valley. When people are counting on you to bring them home safely, you do whatever it takes to succeed, even if it means risking everything you have trained for and believed in. That lesson had been forged in the mountains of Afghanistan, refined in the classrooms of Pensacola, and now it would be proven once again in the dangerous waters where the future of international order hung in the balance.